Hi, I'd like to welcome everyone to our panel on alternate history in films and TV. And we are going to start with the traditional introduction. And I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves. I will start with myself. My name is Eric Flint. I wrote 1632, which produced a very long running series of alternate history novels. I've written some other alternate history series as well. And believe it or not, I write a lot of stuff that's not alternate history, that's science fiction, fantasy, and lines. And we even have a panel on Sunday, if those of you interested, where my publisher, Tony Weisskopf, and I put together a group of basically slideshows of the covers of different books I've done where we talk about them. So uh, I say that because sometimes I get a little grumpy when I go into bookstores and they'll always have the 1632 books up. But, I sort of look at them and say, I write a lot of other stuff, God damn it. And, but they'll have the book when it first comes out, but they typically don't carry it. It's the way it goes. Anyhow, that's why I'm on the panel. And I will like to introduce the others. And I'm going to go counterclockwise the way I'm looking at it. Steve, you're up next.
Okay, I'm Steve Stirling. I publish under Stirling. This is my evil cat, my family. I do a lot of alternate history, as well as science fiction and fantasy, but generally speaking, if I write, say, something that's near future SF, if you look carefully, it's an alternate history. I do this to avoid getting blindsided by not being able to predict the future. I can just say, see, it's an alternate history, always was. Um, Yeah, and I've written gonzo alternate history with like arbitrary changes in the laws of nature. Alien space bats. I've also written a hard alternate history, which I consider more realistic. But alternate history is the ultimate non-falsifiable hypothesis. No one can prove a damn thing.
Belinda?
Hi, I'm Melinda Snodgrass. I'm a screenwriter and a novelist. And I guess my primary work in alternate history is as the co-creator and co-editor, and I also write for Wild Cards, which is our long-running shared world anthology. We have 28 books in the pipeline. I think 26 or 27 of them are published so far. And we do something very strange happens in 1946 over New York City and changes history. The only other thing I've done of my own work, I've done a lot of different, well, I suppose in some ways my White Fang Law series about a woman lawyer working in a vampire law firm in Manhattan is an alternate history with a civil rights movement in the 60s that brought elves and werewolves and vampires, oh my, into our world. And then I did a secret history, a fantasy set in 1670, roughly, about William of Orange and the secret thing that happened when he was a young man. And so I played with it. It's great fun, and trying to figure out what's going to change when you tweak something is always intriguing.
Aaron?
Hello, my name is Aaron Semmel. I am a television and film producer, as well as a development executive in Hollywood. So basically, I find stories and try to translate them to film and TV. I've been doing this for about 20 years. In the course of my career, I've had fingers in such productions as The Good Shepherd, directed by Robert De Niro and starring Matt Damon. I worked on Man of the Year, Robin Williams, directed by, what is his name? Why am I blanking on his name? Now he's in Barry Levinson, an amazing filmmaker. Oh, please forgive me, Barry. Then there's also, more recently, I was co-producer of Hatfields and McCoys, the miniseries starring Kevin Costner and Bill Paxton, which won some Emmys for history several years ago. I've been in the business for about 20 years. I met Eric Flint about 3 or 4 years ago, and we became friends. I'm a big fan of his alternate history writing, and I'm very thankful and grateful that he invited me to come here and talk with you all too.
Chris?
Hi there. My name is Chris Barkley. I am a senior Black correspondent for File770.com. I've been a film reviewer and TV reviewer since 1978. I've had my own radio talk show, and I've been in science fiction fandom for 45 years this coming June. I'm also, I'm also a regular columnist for File 770, doing all sorts of reviewing and things.
Okay. Now, this is, I'm sure, going to wind up being a fairly freewheeling discussion, but I want to establish, I'll call them a couple of rules at the outset, but they're very, very gray rules. And the first one comes from a conversation I had a few days ago with our host, Alexei Vandenberg, where he said to me that he could make a very good case that all movies and TV series that involve anything in history are alternate history. And I said that no, we have to make a distinction between alternate history and bad history. They're not the same thing. Because, you know, if we don't make that distinction, then Alexei's probably right. And the second one is that we're going to wind up with a very expansive definition of alternate history because what's the distinction between alternate history and what's often called secret history, which is an historical account that doesn't seem to change history as it's generally recorded, but it's not what was recorded in the history. And there are a whole lot of stories, both written and in media, that are of that nature, where it's clearly not the real history that actually happened. And some of these can be fantastical as all hell. And then, for instance, to give an example, Jim Butcher's Dresden Files is basically secret history. Up until the book, I've forgotten the title of it, where he has Harry Dresden, his hero, vitalize the statue of Sue, the Tyrannosaurus Rex, in the Chicago Field Museum and charge him, or her rather, into battle. At that point, that history had to become public. I don't think there's any way that you can charge a skeleton of a Tyrannosaurus Rex up Michigan Avenue without it being noticed. And then in his most recent books, one that's come out, the other one coming out very soon, there's a huge battle royal fought in Chicago that levels large parts of the city. So clearly at this point, this is no longer a secret history, but Jim doesn't bother with the fine details of this. He doesn't really care whether you call it alternate history or not, but that is sort of where he's moved to. I have a certain vested interest in it because there have been, Aaron is one, there have been some other attempts to turn the 1632 series into a TV series, which I personally think it would make a very good one, but
I would agree.
Yeah, well, of course it could be done badly, but hopefully it wouldn't be. So part of my interest is to what degree would that be sustained by the audience? Because I used to sort of figure that alternate history was not the kind of thing that a mass audience would be particularly interested in. But then, well, Inglourious Bastards came out and it was quite popular. And then I began realizing there are actually quite a bit more of alternate history that takes place in films and TV series. It's just they typically don't get called that. And there's not the sort of formal rules that those of us like me and Steve who write it tend to try to follow. So anyway, I just thought this made for an interesting discussion, and I am going to shut up in the hopes that someone else will pick it up, and we'll go from there.
Speaking personally, I feel right now, as a Black American, that I'm actually living in an alternate history. I'm just looking for a way to get out. We're back to some other history that's more amenable to me. But I like reading alternate histories and secret histories. You could call a series like Fringe a type of secret alternate history, if anyone remembers
Yeah, I
that
do.
show from Fox, or Wild Wild West for that matter. Although I call that proto steampunk myself.
I myself, I'm a huge
Most
fan of
steampunks.
alternate history as well. It's what led me to Eric's book, 1632, which is an obvious example of alternate history where a point in time is literally become kink and then we change and fragment off. I like it myself mostly because I am a history buff. So for me, the more detailed orientated the actual history is, I find that more enjoyable. And I mean, I might be wrong here. Most readers and don't want to get bogged down in too many details, but when you can stick to an actual factual storyline and implement, new elements for narrative purposes, it's always so fun. Everything from like Eric's book, where you literally fragment and an entire different arm of history breaks off, to like, even having something where you're following a smaller story in a bigger historical piece. Maybe it's something about World War II, but then we're following a much smaller thing that now gives the writer the ability to, change history a little bit. I will say too, right off the bat, I agree with Alexi right away about how in some forms television and film are always forms of alternate history because they're not documentaries, and even documentary footage isn't necessarily a good example of history because used in different contexts, footage, even archival and factual, can be twisted and manipulated. So it's really hard to retell any story without it in some way becoming alternated, you know what I mean? Now for Hollywood, we do it for narrative purposes. I'll use an example of Hatfields and McCoys. When we were making that, that's a family feud that spanned multiple generations and involved hundreds of people. We put that into the scope of 3 nights by what we called compressing time. So, and it's a very popular way to change history. Eric, I also liked how you described it, bad history, or what we said was lazy history. That's the term we use a lot in television, is because we don't like to call ourselves bad. We like to pat ourselves on the back.
Yeah, I was being flippant. I mean,
Yeah, but it's a form of laziness where, you let yourself slip. And when we were doing Hatfields on history as one of their first large scripted productions, there was a big responsibility for us to keep it as factual as we could, especially when you're dealing with such a well-known subject as the Hatfields and McCoy family feud. You're dealing with elements of the Civil War, which history buffs, I'm telling you, we received so many letters about belt buckles and fabric. Like, oh, well, that fabric wasn't even invented then. That wasn't invented until 1922. And it's like, what? Yeah, people keep tabs on this stuff. So we had to keep as factual as we could, but we would use tricks, like we said, compressing time, where something might have taken 2 years. We give the feeling it happens in a season, combining characters, where you find out, oh, we had 177 speaking roles in the first draft of Hatfields and McCoys. We ended up at 72, which, trust me, as a television producer,
A lot of people. Yeah.
astronomically large. It's like crazy.
Yeah.
But 177, what we did is we went through and we said, what characters can now reflect themes and archetypes that then we're able to compress characters? Oh, these 4 or 5 characters are kind of the same. Let's make them the same.
Yeah.
So, and that's altering history. So now, again, I would like to, like Eric said, make a big distinction between that lazy and bad history. and true alternate history. There's a difference between what we're doing, which is just for narrative purposes, and what you guys do as writers, where you're now actually having the fun, creative process of going into history. And like I said, taking what we know and breaking it off and giving us something new. But again, the great ones stick so true to true history, so that even though we're hearing a new story, when true characters come up, we have a sense of how they react because we know them from our own historical education. You know what I mean?
Right.
You know, speaking,
Sorry. With Wild Cards, I not only work on the books, I was developing it for television, for Hulu. Unfortunately, we didn't move forward with it, but a variety of reasons. But, you know, one of the things we had to focus on is we had this enormous, you know, functionally a 9/11 across the world in 1946, and things have changed. But we didn't want to dramatize that. We didn't want to do a historical. We wanted people to come into the world changed and then have to allow them to discover it with the characters. But for that to happen, I mean, I love what you said, Aaron, it's about the people, because we tried to find characters that would resonate with what we hope to be our viewers. You know, you have a lot more time in a book to explain why these things happened, and we had to find a way to, you know, make it meaningful and make people commit and buy in on these people through their stories, through their personal stories. You know, we had a burned out older cop, and we had, you know, various different people, a young politician, a sort of AOC figure. And, you know, we were trying to make it relevant, but also show a world that was tremendously changed. And I think it always comes back to, at least, you know, for us in the visual medium, of how do we tell a story without bogging our viewers down in the history, but make it enticing. And that usually comes through some character who that they really like and they want to invest in and follow through their experience. And television is a very personal thing, much more so than movies that are, you know, people on a 60-foot screen versus the people who are coming into your living room. You know, either you're binging it or once a week. So it's a very different experience.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking to what Melinda just said, I found that some alternate history in visual media, I was thinking of Man in the High Castle, did an impressive job of using visual backgrounds to sketch in historical information, like that opening scene in Times Square with the giant moving photo video with the Nazi symbolism. Of course, that's fairly easy because, you know, everyone knows, or at least knows something about World War II. If you're using a more obscure historical change, you've got a real problem.
Mm-hmm. That was the question I actually wanted to field to you guys coming into this. When Eric, you asked me to do this, this was a question I had. You know, it would be interesting to hear a little bit about how you guys choose your moments of history. Whether, and I mean the big picture of, we picked World War II. I liked what you just said there, Stephen, where it's like, that is that lack of a better word, easy one. So many people know so much stuff about it that you could go into that story, but not everybody chooses World War II. So it's like, how do you choose these worlds you choose to go into? And then specifically, very interesting, where do you put that pin where you're going to break from time? It's that to me is a very interesting question. Like, oh, look, he's rubbing his hands. He's like, I'm ready.
Yeah, I know. Steve, you want to start, Steve? You want me to?
Okay, no, I'll start. Yeah, I wanted to be a historian in my younger days until I found out how long you have to spend as a TA. World War II has been overdone. That doesn't mean it can't be done well in alternate history, but it takes a lot more talent. You know, it's a bit of a lazy man's answer. You have someone in an SS uniform get off the stagecoach and kick a dog, and you know who the villain is. My latest series, Black Chamber, I picked an event in 1912. Teddy Roosevelt was running for the Republican nomination, wanted to take it away from Taft and the Old Guard. He was the progressive candidate. The Old Guard, I've investigated this in detail, used every means up to and including murder to prevent his nomination. So he ran as a third-party candidate. Taft came third. Roosevelt came second. Woodrow Wilson, who was a complete shite, by the way, ran as a Democratic candidate, got 42% of the vote, didn't get a majority in any state that hadn't been a member of the Confederacy, and became president. Okay, in my alternate, Taft, who weighed over 300 pounds and looked like a human walrus, has a heart attack on May 25th, 1912. And at that point, it's too late for the old guard to coalesce around another candidate. Taft's vice president was already very sick, and our history died in October. So Roosevelt sweeps in, and from then on, big changes multiply. But that raises another point. When you're doing alternate history, the easiest things to change are high politics and war. And the reason for that is that decisions that affect the entire world or whole continents are made by limited numbers of people in those settings. And I've been researching World War I for that same series, and about 20 people made the decision to have World War I in 1914. Now, they didn't get the war they expected, but they decided to have a war. 19 of them had von in front of their names, and the only exception was Count Tisza in Hungary, and that was only because Magyars don't use von. But that's a political change, and then military and political ones. That's relatively easy to do. Theoretically, I suppose in 1914, everyone in Europe could have become a Theravada Buddhist, but that's really stretching it.
Yeah.
Cultural stuff is much more resistant to push.
Oh, fun historical note. William
Yeah.
Howard Taft from Cincinnati, Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
Yep.
Didn't he get stuck in a bathtub?
That's
Yes,
I think that's a myth myself.
No, I looked into that, and he actually did get stuck in a bathtub and had to have a new one installed. I've seen a picture of the new one he had installed, and there are 3 guys sitting in it, and they're not crowded.
Yeah.
Well, there's your departure point right there. He stays in the bathtub. Oh, never mind.
He's like FDR. The rest of his term is served in a bathtub.
Yeah.
The whole administration goes down the drain.
There you go, the tagline.
Well, Teddy Roosevelt had Taft as a sparring partner while Teddy was president, because he was one of the first Americans to study judo intensively, and he insisted on Taft coming over and helping him spar, and apparently the whole White House shook when Taft was thrown.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I bet. I picked, well, actually, I did the Belisarius series, the first alternate history I wrote, because I got commissioned to do it by Jim Bain. It was after he'd published my first novel. Well, he hadn't published it yet, but he bought it. And he asked me if I'd like to do a trilogy with David Drake that was, he asked me if I knew who the General Belisarius was. And I said, yeah, and I gave him a sketch of it. So he said, okay, so you know the period. And Jim was a Belisarius fanboy. He had Steve and Dave do the General series, which was basically taking the life of Belisarius and making it science fictional. And he did the reverse with in our case, which is he took the real Belisarius, quote unquote, and did an alternate history version of it. And David Drake plotted it out, and then I was the one who wound up writing it. And in the course, I expanded on it. To this day, Dave likes to tease me that he would have written it in 3 books. I turned it into 6. But what made that series work for me, because as is true with pretty much any good writer I know, yes, you have to entertain your audience, and we're all trying to do that. But most books, there's a point to them that the author is trying to get across. And I mean, the point may be modest. It may be don't mess with hard-boiled detectives, but whatever it is, there is a theme to most books. And what I found interesting about the way Dave had plotted this, when I read through the whole plot and thought about it, I realized that it was the humans of the far future who were the villains and the sort of aliens who were the good guys. And I said, is that the case? He said, yeah. Now, the aliens weren't actually aliens. They were artificial constructs that had been originally created by humans, you're going back far enough. And so the theme of that series is basically, what does it mean to be human in the first place? Is that defined by your genetics, or is it what you do? And, your culture, essentially. And Dave came down very strongly on that one side of the equation. What happened with 1632 was I had the idea for a small coal mining town in northern West Virginia as a collective protagonist for a very long time. I had lived in that area. and I had been a labor activist in those days. I did quite a bit of work with, I was never a member of that union, but I worked with them a lot. And it always struck me that a small collective coal mining town would make a great collective protagonist for something. I just didn't know what. And I eventually happened to be reading C.B. Wedgwood's classic History of the 30 Years' War, doing research for a completely different book that wound up never being written. And it dawned on me the 30 Years' War would be the perfect setting for that town to be plugged in, precisely because the war was such a bloody mess. It was not one of those wars where you can draw clean arrows and they went, like the Civil War or World War II. This was just 30 years worth of slaughter is what it amounted to. And there's a funny story, Steve, I'm sure I've told you this. I told David Drake that I'd submit, what the idea was, and that I'd written an outline and I submitted as a proposal. And he said, "Have you read Steve Stirling's Island: A Sea of Time?" And my heart stopped. It's like, oh no. And they said, "Relax. There's enough differences that it won't be a problem." But he said, and Steve and I have talked about it since then. And what surprises us, because we came up with it completely independently of each other. What we find surprising is that nobody else, as far as we know, before us ever thought of doing a time travel, but use a whole town, or in his case, Allen and Nantucket, instead of just one individual. But to get back to the original point is, the point of that series is, I think that people in the modern world, and certainly Americans, tend to underestimate, don't really understand how profound the basic concepts of democracy and equality are, and how they impact on human life and human history, because we sort of take them for granted. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to take modern Americans, and I picked a relatively rural town, a small town in northern West Virginia. It's heavily working class. These are not city dwellers by any means. They're mostly, people like coal miners, farmers, small businessmen. For two reasons. One, I wanted to call them average Americans, whatever. But the other reason is, to be honest, I needed a fairly well-armed population. So they'd survive the first stretch of it. I could have plunked the University of Chicago down, but I think
kind of hard to kill people with algorithms.
In the middle of the 30 Years' War would not have lasted real long.
Slide rules? No, that's not going to work.
But that was the point to it. And there's a different kind of point that came up with the series I'm doing. It's set in the Jacksonian era. One thing I have sworn is I will never write an alternate history set in either the Civil War or World War II or the Napoleonic era, because I don't want to deal with a jillion nitpickers sending me emails and pestering me because, oh, no, there were 3 rows of buttons on this side, not 2 rows. And, these people get obsessive. The advantage I have dealing with the 30 Years' War, there is only one group of reenactors in America that reenact the 30 Years' War, and I made friends with them early.
I have to laugh because all of you're so thoughtful. And what happened with Wild Cards was a strange writer who dictated that it became an alternate history. George and I knew our theme. We wanted to explore what would really happen if there were superheroes. I mean, how would that honestly affect the world? Politics, culture, law, which I used to be a lawyer before I got better. And so, we had that approach. And, we had intended to start these books right when we were developing the series back too many years ago. I don't want to mention, it'll give away how old I am. So, but instead we then went out, it's a shared world. So we were asking other writers, come and play in our sandbox that George and I have created. Isn't this wonderful, our sandbox? And Howard Waldrop, who is brilliant, but an odd duck, shall we say, Howard said to George when he was invited in, I will do it, but I have to write the first story, and it has to happen on my birthday, September 15th, 1946. And George and I went, oy, now what are we going to do? But, George, dear friend, he said, all right, Howard, we'll start this in 1946. And it was the best thing that ever happened to us, because then we were able to see how did the House Un-American Activities Committee affect it when it was about superheroes and not about communists. And, what happened with Vietnam, and how did the civil rights movement change, because we have a group of people who are othered in that society. And so it actually ended up making everything so much more interesting and giving it so much more depth. I mean, we have this one we have one of our writers who's a huge baseball fan. And he knew this little known fact that Fidel Castro actually tried out for the Brooklyn Dodgers. And so John said, well, he doesn't actually become a dictator and change Cuba. He becomes a baseball player, and now he's a coach for the Brooklyn Dodgers when our book starts. And it's just those little things that are just so crunchy and nice, and that a reader, and hopefully someday viewers, will have fun with when Coach Castro is coming out to speak to us, and it'll just be an aside, if we get to ever shoot this thing. But I think it's so funny because you all put such effort in, and George and I were just, slapped in the face with a Howard fish, so to speak. Oh, okay, well, I guess we're doing this.
Yeah, I can just see it now. I can just see it now. Oh, Castro's coming out of the dugout. He does not look happy. He's seen enough.
Yeah,
Gotta have a cigar. He obviously will be smoking cigars on the baseball field too.
Yeah, exactly.
And the commissioner would be all over him for that.
Yeah.
That's those little details I was talking about that, again, just talking as a fan, but in a fan who does try to translate some stuff to screen. It's those little details that are always so much fun. And then when they have some reflection to the real world, that's why it's so easy for us to jump right into, he's coming out of the pit and he doesn't look happy. Like, of course Castro doesn't look happy. It would be weird if he was happy. Of course you'd be smoking a cigar, because even if he's in this alternate universe, you want to give people a little relatability, a little something that teases the reality,
Yep.
And Castro does not kick dirt on the umpire's shoes. No. He gets out the cigar, boom, right in the umpire's face, and you're out of here.
To go back to something that Aaron, you said earlier, film and TV is a very, very different medium from written stories, and it's something that I found a lot of writers, and seems like almost all fans, don't quite grasp. I know I've had fans when I get talking about possibility of 1632 series being turned into a TV series, and I can't tell you how many times at conventions I have fans say, make sure you keep control over it. And it's like a TV episode costs somewhere between $3 million, $5 million. Nobody is going to pay $3 to $5 million to make one episode and say, oh, but we're letting this guy control it. I mean, grow up, for Christ's sake. It's just the reality of life. But the other thing is, you have to understand how different the mediums are. And my novel, 1632, is 180,000 words long. The average movie script for a full-length movie, I think, is around 20,000 words, somewhere around there.
120 pages?
Yeah,
Usually.
I mean, yeah. And now there are things you can compress very easily in a film. You can depict something that a writer might take a while to have to depict, but it usually works the other way around. And the end result is that somebody in Aaron's position doing something like that, of course, you have no choice if you're going to make a story that's coherent than to do what you're calling compression. You have to, or else. I got an argument once with the writer who said that all characters in a story, no character should be one-dimensional. They should all be multi-dimensional. And I said, for God's sakes, Guildenstern and Rosencrantz have to be three-dimensional characters? Like,
Yeah,
that's already 3 hours long.
About every time you add a speaking part to a book, you're adding 20,000 words.
Yeah.
You got
The
to
viewpoint
describe
character,
them,
yeah.
do everything. Who is this person?
No,
Where?
it's I've told writers that I don't know how to make the book longer. I said the fastest, easiest way to make a book longer is just add another viewpoint character, and it'll almost automatically happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Without you having to screw around with a plot. It's just the way it is. But that's because a reader can take hours and hours to read a book, and readers are used to doing that, so they don't mind it. But very, very few people are going to sit down in a movie theater for 10 hours straight. And they're just not going to do it. And not even Wagner fans will do it.
You had to break those up.
But the 4 or 5 hours maybe, and even then there has to be at least 2 intermissions. So I don't consider that bad history. What I mean is what irritates me is watching a film that's got or a TV series that's got historical material, and they're doing things that are just stupid. It's with a modicum of research, you could have figured out things that drive me nuts. You do not do a cavalry charge downhill. Horses
But
are
dramatically, it looks better.
big animals are very, very twitchy about.
It worked for John Ford.
Yeah, I know.
Eric, something I often talk about with writers, and these are the film writers, so I'll distinguish that. So when we go into the film process, we look at a script much more as a roadmap to a story, whereas a novel is a story.
Yeah.
Like the novel, you read it, it's like, oh yeah, and that's that. To me, I've always said that's a clear way to look at the differences. The movie roadmap is constantly in flux. I mean, to talk about the point of control, who's in control? Eric, nobody's in control. Like making movies and television, I always say it's like controlled chaos. We're one of the few art forms, if you could call what we do art, that requires hundreds, if not thousands of people to get involved. Yeah. And when really fingers getting into the process, I mean, that's so many people that, to me, I always say it's amazing it even works. Your directors and your producers, those would be your top guys you could say have some form of control, but not even them. At the end, there are 3 movies that happen in the process of telling your story. There's the movie you write, then there's the movie you film, and then there's the movie everyone sees.
Right.
And the movie everyone sees is a combination of everything, working with an editor to put together a story so in some way you could watch it on the screen and it makes sense. As a writer, it's great because you could take your time. Stephen mentioned something about Man in the High Castle, which is a great example. Stephen, I'm talking about you right now. I was talking about how you were talking about Man in the High Castle, which is a fantastic example of a show right now that is true alternate history. And how you were talking about Times Square and storytelling through visuals. In our business, like I was saying, there's lazy history. There's also what I call lazy filmmaking. And that's just your normal cut and dry, film a scene, go on to your next thing, blah, blah. That's lazy to me. Great filmmakers take time to tell stories visually. Right. And to do that, we will take a book, like an alternate history book, like 1632, that, we have a lot to cover there. We have to tell the history of the town and the people who are our characters. And then we have to tell the history of 1632, the 30-year war, all these things going on. So there's all these histories that we have to tell. So we'll cheat, and we'll do it by showing a newspaper. Mm-hmm. It shows 4 or 5 historical events right there on the cover. Boom. You see that a lot in TV. Billboards, great example, Stephen. Easy, especially Times Square. Put up a lot of billboards. Show them a place that they know there's a lot of billboards, and now show them how history's changed on those billboards. Instead of McDonald's, it's Von Donald's or whatever, all of a sudden those little tiny ways to tell story visually, so that in 3 seconds, you see Times Square and you know so much. Whereas opposed in a book, that's 30 pages.
Yeah, you
You
got to
know,
take more
of
time.
really going through and telling it. So it's not just compressing time. There's all sorts of tricks we use in film and TV to tell our stories. Now, those tricks don't always translate, and that's where it gets really hard. Like taking a book and translating it to film gets difficult because the different mediums use different tricks to do it. So a good example I always use is the internal POV books. I mean, you're talking 50-60% of the books written in the world are internal POV. We don't get to do that in film. You know, we don't get to sit there and be like, I was thinking she was being wrong. We don't get to do that. We have to show it or say it somehow. So the internalized thinking is always a difficult thing for us.
Voiceovers kill.
Yeah, like we hate narrators. We hate voiceover. Like nobody wants to watch a whole movie.
It's I've seen it done. I've almost never seen it done well.
It's really hard.
It's just not the medium. It's a medium that sees things from the outside. It has to.
And this is a convention about the Ring of Fire. So I could talk a little bit about what attracted me to 1632 as a film person, just as an example, because again, there are things that are hard to translate, and then there are things that are easy. And we look at it and we go, oh my God, 1632 is just right. I mean, Eric, you know how I feel about it. It's a fantastic.
Well, part of it is
story.
that I've told people this many times at conventions or subject comes up and I'm on a panel, you know, who's your biggest literary influence? And in my case, as far as being a storyteller, the single biggest literary influence on me was the Japanese film director, Akira Kurosawa, which I've been a real fan of my whole life. And I when I figure out a story, I sort of think of them. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it's sort of, I tell stories kind of like the way I think at least Kurosawa would tell them. So a lot of it's visual, and especially I used inner thoughts more when I was earlier in my career than I do now. And I will tend to my stories tend to be told in scenes. They're not flow through. They tend to be, okay, here's an episode, here's an episode, here's an episode. So I never really thought about it till you said that to me, you know, 3, 4 years ago. And I think it's probably true. But I can still tell you it really is a different medium. I had that driven home to me when I was working with a friend of mine who's a filmmaker. And we were trying to put together a webisode, about an 8 to 10 minute little film based on a spin-off of a different novel I wrote. And I wrote the script, and Jason looked at it and said, do you mind if I rewrite this? I said, no, go ahead. And he rewrote it, and his version, exactly the same thing happens. I mean, it's my story, but he turned it into film language, and it was obvious to me how much better it would be filmed. You know, I mean, the way I did it was the way a novelist thinks, but and he cut one of the characters, shrank 3 characters down to 2. There was a lot more action and things you'd see from the outside, visual stuff, but exactly the same story. I mean, it wasn't like he threw out what I had happened and invented something different. It was the same story. It's just that's the different skill set involved. It's a different way of telling a story. And I don't have a problem with that because good stories are very tough. I mean, they can handle being told and retold in lots of different ways and still, the story will still come through. And if anybody wants to argue with me, just go take a look at any one of a jillion different versions of Macbeth, or Hamlet, or King Lear. A really good story can be handled lots and lots of different ways. As long as
I like how you say that. I've never heard that. A good story is tough. Because
Yeah,
I was
a good story's really
I'm
tough.
thinking that it is hard to make a good story, but it's like, no, a good story can take a beating.
Well, you can also change it around. You can change elements of it, and it's not exactly the same story, but it's the same I mean, honestly, look at, for instance, Shakespeare's King Lear, and then go watch Akira
Kurosawa.
Kurosawa's version of it,
Mm-hmm.
which all kinds of things change. There's 3 sons instead of 3 daughters, and so on and so forth. There's all kinds of changes.
Ren, yeah.
Huh? Or if
Right.
you want another example, see Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress and then go see Star Wars.
I did. I
Yeah,
actually did that.
Did you?
I did back to back. Aces.
Yeah. And I'll give Lucas credit. He's always given credit to Kurosawa for that. He's never tried to hide his debt to him. But
Well,
that's what you have to understand that. You're talking about different medium, and you're not going to be able to tell the same story the same way using 2 completely different media to do it with. You're just
well,
not.
I'll give you an example. Who here has read Gregory Benford's Timescape? Okay. Timescape.
I think I did, but it was so long ago I don't really remember.
All right. So the basic setup is that the world, ecologically speaking, is ending. And someone, a radio astronomer, figures out a way to send messages into the past using a radio telescope. But when he does that, is he going back to his past or someone else's past? And that's, you know, the balance of the story is, yes, you can affect the past, but is it going to be your past or is it too late?
Ooh, interesting. That's cool. Because again, I was also going to say a cool thing in alternate history is to see that butterfly effect, to see that one change and then the ripple, you know, to kind of see how that's affected. And even when you make that jump, where it happens a lot in alternate history, where the change happens and then we jump to now let's see how much it's changed.
Right.
Even then, letting the audience, whether they're reading or viewers, letting them know why those things changed a lot of times throughout your story. So those are playing out where all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's how that evolved into that. And those for me are always the fun kind of revelations that make this genre fun to get into, you know?
Yeah.
You know, going back something you said a while back, Aaron, you know, it's not just movies that are always doing alternate histories. The truth is, histories are always doing alternate histories. I mean, I used to teach historiography way long ago when I was a teaching assistant at UCLA, and when there was a year-long course that was required if you were a history major on, it's not exactly the philosophy of history, but it's the method of history. You know, you have to actually think about what history is. And, you know, nobody can go back to the past and take, you know, an actual film of what exactly happened. You know, you're getting it through accounts. Sometimes there's film footage, sometimes there's not, but you weren't there. No, you know, nobody writing history now was there during the American Revolution. So every generation of historians tends to be constantly interpreting it. And it doesn't mean it's completely subjective. There are facts that get established and nobody argues about, you know, the fact. But exactly how it happened, how people thought, what they thought, and so on and so forth.
Lives or who dies and who tells your story.
Yeah. No, really, and if you think about it, if you think of your own memory of your own life, the truth is it's a narrative that you're to some degree constantly retelling yourself, and it's the reason that I had a friend of mine wrote a book about his experiences as an organizer in the Vietnam anti-war movement. And he said, I had to go back and document everything. He said, because I learned I could not trust my own memory of what I did, you know, and you have to double check it. And
I'm a recovering lawyer too. And that was one of the things they really hate. They really hit us with when we were doing Crim Pro, was that nothing is more unreliable than eyewitness testimony.
Yeah.
And if you let a bunch of witnesses to something talk with each other afterwards, they'll come out with a uniform story, but it won't necessarily be the one that's closest to the facts. It'll just be the one with the dominant personality held. And they'll just all rewrite their memories and be perfectly sincere.
This
And
is something. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Then they showed us what was supposedly security cam footage of a bank robbery, and had us all describe it separately afterwards with a list of questions. One of the questions was, what was the weapon that the robber was using? And we thought it was a real tape. It was actually staged. And there were all sorts of answers: pistol, revolver, Colt automatic, Uzi. It was a banana.
It's a banana.
But no one wrote down it was a banana.
It's amazing. And to this point too, this is a quote from a fantastic filmmaker who I had the privilege of working with, Kevin Costner. He's a big history buff, as a lot of people know, and he once told me, never judge the history of the past with your present lens. Mm-hmm. And that is very difficult. And Chris just said something a minute ago, and it's so true. It's the winners write the history. And honestly, history is constantly changing. It is. There is no set history, because we're constantly learning and relearning our own history.
Revisionist history.
We're in the middle of a big movement right now, where it's like people right now are saying, oh, there's all these different versions of America. We want to know what the true history of America is. It's like, well, there's about 300 million different histories in this country, because every one of us has had a different experience, and that's going to lead us to understand history differently. So right now, there's no one common form of history. It's however it comes together, and it's hard for us to be subjective about that and not look at it through our own lens and say, oh, that history's wrong, or that history doesn't align, or as Eric and Stephen say, a lot of times people actually, I don't want to use the word lie to themselves, but trick themselves into believing something so it aligns with what they believe should be the history. You could show them the facts, you could show them everything, and they'll still deny it, because it can't align. It can't align with things, so they've written their own
cognitive biases.
Yeah.
They're omnipotent. And I think something that Eric said, we both chose to throw small towns back in time. Him with 1632 and me with Island in the Sea of Time. One of the reasons I picked the Bronze Age to send the town back to 1250 BC was that there are just enormous gaps, particularly outside the literate areas around the Mediterranean. So you can make stuff up, and as long as it doesn't contradict the stones and bones, no one can say you were wrong. And I thought, aha. And then a decade later, scientists developed the ability to isolate and analyze DNA from ancient skeletons. And it just so happens that this enables you to trace migrations accurately for the first time. There's a big controversy in archaeological circles over when migrations happened, whether they happened, whether people were just imitating each other's pots, or whether people moved, that sort of thing. This completely invalidated all the scenes I set in Britain in Island of the Sea of Time. It turns out that there was this huge migration about 1,000 years before I set the scenes in Britain, and it completely reformatted the place, and the cultures that I described couldn't have been the way they were because of this new discovery. So even though I took the precaution of setting things over 3,000 years back, historians, or in this case genetic archaeologists, just blew me out of the water.
Yeah, but look, here's I did something.
That's what I'm thinking. Prequel. You just have to write an alternate history prequel now, so that your thing makes sense.
Just leave it alone, because nobody's really going to care. What I found happens is that if you're being, I did something more extreme than that, because I did it consciously, which was that in the Belisarius series, I had to depict what India would be like in the 6th century, because the whole story takes place in 530s AD, during the era of Justinian in Eastern Roman Empire. And the problem, if you're and I have to dramatize it, it's not going to be dry history. It's got to have real characters in it and so forth. And the problem is partly because Indians, unlike Europeans and Chinese, Indians don't have the same historical tradition in terms of recording history, number one. Secondly, the climate just chews up historical materials. So there, coins will survive and archaeological stuff will survive, but manuscripts tend to get chewed up. So there's really not much known about the culture. So what I did was, the Marathas I depicted were basically the Marathas of the 17th century, about which quite a bit's known, and the Rajputs I depicted were pretty much the Rajputs of the 1800s. So, I mean, I was cheating, but nobody's ever complained about it, including Indian readers, because it's, I don't know how to put it, it's sort of honest. It's like, you're not, all you're trying to do is depict the culture in its richness, which it certainly had. But in order to do that, I had to kind of meld periods from later periods because there's no alternative. Otherwise, I would have just been inventing it out of whole cloth, which I didn't want to do.
I want to jump in.
I'm willing to bet you, Steve, that nobody except maybe a grumpy genetic historian is going to give you a hard time about it. And
No.
I want to jump in and I want to ask Melinda a question.
Okay.
Do you have a favorite alternative history story?
Oh, and my mind just absolutely went completely blank. Isn't that embarrassing? Can I get back to you on that? Because I honestly
Here,
can't
hey
think of.
Melinda, can I throw you a lifeline?
Please throw me a lifeline. Oh, yes, I was trying to think books, but yeah,
Okay.
that would have been definitely, that was a world we would have liked to have seen, wasn't
I'd
it?
like to be there right now.
Now. I'll join you there, Chris, let me tell you. Yeah, we do try to, but I realize that a lot of what you were talking about, especially Eric, is theme. I mean, you were talking about, Hamlet can be done 20 different ways, and King Lear, and I was on a panel about writing for film and television, and I was explaining to the audience that I always start with the theme. Plot is easy if you know what this is about. I mean, not even what it's about. I said on the panel, and I was somewhat salty in my language, but I said, plot is the shite that happens, but theme is why it matters.
Yeah.
And, if you don't know what the theme is, then it doesn't matter how many bells and whistles and cool stuff you lard on the top of it. There has to be this foundation. And I think, good writers always start from, what am I trying to say about the human condition? And what is the human heart in conflict with itself? What is that saying? And then you can do whatever wild thing you want on top of that, if that true heart is there. And if it's not, then it's just sound and fury. And, we haven't actually, not only entertained, but communicated. And I think that's why I love this profession so much, whether I'm writing books or writing a script. It's that, wondering who I'm reaching with those words and with that emotion. And that's what I love about our field and about what we do, whether we're doing it in a visual medium, as Aaron and I sometimes do, or on the printed page. So
Amen.
thank you for the lifeline, Chris.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and also say that that's why a stage production like Hamilton is just brilliant in the way it brings people in. It brings African Americans in because African Americans are portraying the founding fathers, and it brings up all sorts of questions about not about historical fact, but the motivations behind the history. And I think that's why, even though it's undergoing somewhat of a cultural churning right now, saying that, okay, it's had its moment, let's move on. I don't think so. I think people are going to be coming back to Hamilton again and again and again, just for inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you. And I think also part of what happens with, especially a nation like the United States, is people don't quite realize that nobody since the late Roman Republic and early Roman Empire has tried to forge a whole realm out of this many just disparate elements of people from all over the place. I mean, that was the last time it was done on this scale.
And people are crazy now.
Yeah,
Crazier.
well, people have been crazy. I mean,
Yeah.
you know,
Oh,
part of what I hear
with
people
technology,
say
it's just gone out the window.
yeah, part of what I hear people say, well, we're so polarized now. It's like, yeah, we are, but that has happened before. Don't think it hasn't. You know, all those Canadians who view the War of 1812 as their war of independence against the American oppressors all came from the United States because they didn't come from England. They were Tories who were driven north and they settled in Canada. So, you know, we've been through this before. We'll come out of this one.
I'd just like to come out of it alive. Thank you
Yeah,
very
no,
much.
so would I.
This is also an interesting.
No one gets out of life
what we're
alive.
talking about
But
here.
to go back to what you were saying, though, Chris, I think that this is what constantly happens. You're constantly basically what storytelling is a way a culture is constantly looking at itself in a mirror and having this kind of collective discussion about who we are and what we're about. And a lot of it happens through the arts. It really does. And
Watchmen. Watchmen.
Yeah.
Definitely
And,
Watchmen. Definitely it's going to be Lovecraft country.
oh, I started watching that and I decided to stop watching it because my wife Lucille hasn't started yet, and I want to watch it with her. But I have thoroughly
It'll give you
enjoyed
the
the way they took
heebie-jeebies.
Lovecraft's really vicious racism
Yeah.
and sort of stood it on its head because the story is all focused on African Americans of a really bad period in American history. Yeah, I'm enjoying it.
Good.
I haven't gotten very far into it yet, though. Just about 2 seasons.
Oh, you have not. You haven't seen anything yet.
Yeah, but I enjoy that a lot, and I enjoyed that part of Hamilton. I mean, it's the funny thing is that one of the stuffiest art forms we have is opera, and opera's been doing this forever. I mean, Lou and I just went to see the Chicago Lyric Opera put on a really good performance of Wagner's Ring, and the character of Wotan is sung by a really great African-American bass baritone, you know, and nobody thinks twice about, you know, the Nordic god is being played by an African-American, but he's got the voice for it. That's all that matters.
Of course not. They've seen the Thor movies.
Yeah.
Heimdall is played by Idris Elba. Come on, man.
Yeah, I know. Idris Elba is Heimdall, yeah.
I have to take exception with you, Eric. I studied opera in Vienna. I love opera. I don't think it's stuffy.
Oh, I do too. No, I do too. But it's
it combines all of the, you know, I mean, it was like television and video games for the 18th, you know, 17th.
Oh, no, absolutely.
Exactly.
And always, I will say,
you know,
definitely very groundbreaking and always pushing the envelope. And again, like Eric said, even back in the 1700s and 1800s, multi-ethnical, multicultural people and all sorts of productions. It was a weird art form that it was able to do that.
yeah, if you had the voice and, you know,
that was the thing. It's so hard to have the right voice.
Yeah.
And you see it the other way around. Leontine Price got famous because, you know, her performance of Aida, but, you know, God, she sang all kinds of roles. I mean, she sang Madame Butter. She was the lead in Madame Butterfly, for instance. And, you know, it's like, okay, you got an African-American woman singing a Japanese. Yeah, but she's got the voice for it. That's what matters. And it's just, what I meant by stuffy was people think of it as not avant-garde. And it's like, well, maybe, but they've been doing this for a long time and only twice about it.
We know how to duel and commit suicide and die wonderfully, you know, given the opportunity. Kathleen Battle, I was listening to her today as I was running errands. So sorry to digress into opera, and Alexi screaming at us that it's time.
Is Alexi giving us a note? Yeah, he
Give us a little thumbs up and everything.
Yeah.
Oh, and I wanted to get in my Elon Musk anecdote. Oh, well.
Go ahead.
Tell me later. I have to hear it. I'm curious.
Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to point out that the true innovators in history like the Elon Musks and Tesla and Edison, they may have some celebrity over time and they may be celebrated, but it all comes back. It all comes back when all the bad stuff gets dug up by revisionist history. So I'm not sure any of it really matters.
That's kind of what I was saying. It's hard to view history through our present lens. You know, I will never deny the atrocities and horrible things that happened throughout history, but it has led us to down the road to where we are today. I have many friends who have had hard lives, and they've often thrown a quote at me that those hardships, they wouldn't trade them for the world, because it's exactly what made them who they are. So I'm a firm believer in learning from the past nonstop. If somebody has a new story, tell it to me. If it goes against what I thought, explain why I thought different. Like, teach me. If you're wrong, I'll teach you. Like, we have to keep talking about this history, you know, and, you know, this is a weird way to say it, but it's kind of like, I don't think anything should be whitewashed or gotten rid of. You know, we have to look at these things, warts and all, you know,
Right.
and
I agree.
And come to understand America is a great country. It really is. It's an amazing country. Did we have some problems to get to where we are today? Of course. Do we have scars on us? Of course. Everybody does. To deny that is not good. But then also dwell on it and say these scars define us. That's not true either. You know, that's the really hard thing is to.
And it's always been a constant struggle. It's not just as it's been laid out in grade school and high school for me back in the 60s and 70s. It was like this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, but all the context has been removed.
Exactly.
So it's one of the miracles of our educational system that it makes history dull.
True. However, I must say that when I was in high school, and this was at the height of Watergate, I knew so much about Watergate and contemporary history, I got exempted from my senior high school exam. I was the only one in my class to be exempted from the senior high school American history exam.
Well done.
It's addictive, though. The more you learn, the more you get into it.
Exactly.
It was funny. I was just telling my wife today the story of when I was working as a development executive. We were working on a story about World War II and the warlords, and we were looking to option a book called The Warlords, and it was about the four guys.
Is that John Hershey? Was that John Hershey's book?
I can't remember.
No, the war that you're thinking of the War Lover.
Oh, okay.
John Hershey. No.
Yeah, this was a nonfiction 700-page textbook with, like, I'm not kidding you, like a 40-page note section to go through to tell you where all the anecdotes went and everything. So it's in our development staff, and we're like, oh, who's going to read this thing? Who's got time to read this? I had an intern. I gave it to my intern, this kid fresh out of college. I give it to him. I'm like, hey, man, I need you to read this book and cover it. You know, I need you to write a report on it. Took him 2 weeks to read the book, another week to write the report. This kid gave me like an 18-page report. And afterwards, I apologize. I'm like, I'm so sorry you had to do this. He was so grateful, just like you said, Chris. He said, I know World War II inside and out now. It's like any conversation I get into with a 70-year-old vet to a 12-year-old, nobody's going to know what I know now from reading this book. You know, so it's like the more you learn these historical facts and these things, I think it becomes addictive. So it's, you know, unfortunately, I think our education system is set up in a way where they teach a very broad basic. And I'm always one to say, hey, it's up to all of us. It's our responsibilities to bring that up to par. You know, they really are. I mean, the education system's not the best. Come on, let's not get there. But at the same time, they're trying to figure things out. They're trying to set this base guideline for us all. It's for us now to read more. Like you said, Chris, it's for us to find the context. You know, they're going to teach us what happened. It's really for us to find the context.
Exactly.
And to wrap it all up in alternative history, I think that's what's so appealing about alternative history is it gives us a chance to go back, evaluate history, look at it, and then say, what would we change? what would we do to make it different? How can we, what would have improved life, or what would have changed life on this planet? And that's alternate history, to go back and really pick a moment and bing, break it off and change the world, for at least the viewers or the readers. I think that's the real appealing thing about it.
Not to mention that history is full of great stories and things and people that you wouldn't dare invent. Like Teddy Roosevelt, while he was vice president, went on a hunting trip because he felt completely useless, as vice presidents usually do. And he was hunting cougar in Colorado, and the dogs were mobbing a cougar, big one, 215-pound male, a record. And he couldn't get a clear shot. So he was afraid the dogs were going to get hurt. So he rode up, leapt off his horse onto the cougar, and stabbed it to death with a Bowie knife. Now, gospel, this actually happened. He is the only vice president of the United States to leap on and kill a large cougar with a Bowie knife.
And the cougar saying, "No fair, man, no fair."
Steve, you'll never hear the end of it.
I'll tell you what, not to get political, but the way this election's going this year, I would like to see our 4 bad boys in a ring with a cougar, and whoever survives is our guy, I guess. I mean, I feel like it's just, that's about as good a way to decide as any.
That's going to be Kamala Harris.
All right.
I've got
It's
a
going to be Kamala Harris.
that goes
All
to
right.
that. He was asked, how would he improve the Senate? And he said, call a joint session of both houses of Congress, lock the doors, and turn a dozen lions loose inside. Yeah. He was talking to a senator when he said this.
Not just any lions, female lions.
Yeah, damn right, guys.
The senator,
All right.
senator he was talking to said,
Eric's like, this is turning too political. We have to keep it down.
All right.
Sorry.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for having us.